The two officers helped Anna Buck to her unsteady feet, holding her elbows. She stared around her with dazed eyes, not recognizing him, even though he'd once saved her life. Marvel bent and picked up a photograph a few feet away. It was swimming in water, and he shook it at arm's length so the droplets flicked off the corners. "Don't touch him!" Marvel froze, but the girl wasn't talking to him. She was shouting at the big woman with the tattoos and the nose ring who was reaching into the buggy. "Don't touch my baby!" she yelled. She tried to shrug off the two police officers holding her arms, but their instinct was to tighten their grip, and they held her fast. Aguda spoke soothingly. "It's okay. She's not going to hurt him, Mrs. Buck. Calm down." Mrs. Buck didn't calm down. She started to thrash against the two men holding her, shouting and trying to break free. The woman with the tattoos looked frightened. The child was in her arms, but she didn't know what to do next. "It's okay. Look, it's okay." Aguda quickly crossed to the big woman and carefully took the baby from her so that the mother could see him. "Look, Mrs. Buck, look, he's fine. I'll bring him to—" She stopped halfway between the buggy and the hysterical mother, staring down at the baby in her arms. "Don't hurt him. Give him to me. I have to keep him safe." The woman lunged and writhed, but Emily Aguda didn't move. Instead, she looked straight across the room at Marvel. "Sir?" she said, and the hackles on the back of his neck went up like a dog's. Then she dropped the baby. Anna Buck shrieked, and Marvel moved so fast to catch the falling child that he skidded across the wet floor and fell to one knee with a furious crunch. "Shit!" he yelled at Aguda. "What are you doing?" The blue blanket slid to the wet floor, but the baby was suspended in mid-air, dangling by one arm from Aguda's hand. Anna Buck thrashed and shouted, and Marvel thought, "This'll cost us a fortune in damages." Aguda looked down at Marvel, wide-eyed. Then she made a fist. Marvel held up his hands to stop her. "No, no!" But too late. She rapped her knuckles on the baby's head, and Anna Buck screamed. The baby didn't flinch. The baby didn't cry. The baby didn't even wake up. "It's not real," said Aguda. "What?" "It's not real, sir." Marvel realized he was down on one knee in front of Aguda, as if he was going to propose, and got wincingly to his feet. He hadn't moved that far since he was 16. He'd pulled a groin muscle, and his knee was a ball of pain. "What the hell?" he said. Aguda held the baby out to him, and he took it from her gingerly. It was remarkable. Even through his anger and pain, and Anna Buck's hysteria, Marvel was amazed. Every eyelash, every vein, every fingernail, the weight of it, the way the head lolled. It was all absolutely perfect. There was even a little bubble of saliva on the wet lips. He touched it with a finger, and it was solid, like glass. But the heart's beating," he said. He could feel it under the heel of his hand. Aguda leaned in curiously and opened the top buttons of the little blue romper suit. "Don't hurt him," cried Anna Buck. "Don't hurt him." They both ignored her. Stitched to the cotton body of the baby, there was a soft, heart-shaped pad with 2 wires running from it that beat a baby rhythm. "Jesus Christ," said Marvel in awe. "That's the creepiest thing I've seen in my whole fucking life." All around him, the thieves and the victims and the liars got slowly off their benches and moved closer to wonder at the fake baby, like fake wise men and shepherds. Marvel let them. They'd earned the right, and it could do no harm. Mrs. Buck had screamed herself out and was sobbing quietly between the two officers now. "Let her go," he told them. "She's nuts." They did, and she rushed across the room and reclaimed the wondrous, hideous doll, picking up the wet blanket and wrapping it up, then placing it carefully back in the buggy, weeping all the time. They all stood and watched her, stunned by the depth of her madness. The burglar held the door open for her, and she left, still crying. When the glass door closed behind her, there was a subdued silence. Then, very slowly, things started to return to normal. Aguda began to soak up the water from the floor with paper towels. The two officers picked up the defibrillator and went back to work. The sergeant, who'd taken over behind the window, called out a name, and the old man in the hat shuffled over to him to report whatever he'd come in to report 100 years ago. Marvel bent to pick up the photo he'd dropped in his skid across the floor. "Is this hers?" he asked Aguda, and she looked at it and nodded sadly. "She said it was telling her things," she said. "Poor woman." He snorted. "Telling her how to pull a scam. The fake baby was probably a part of it." Sandra Clyde's roots were showing in this photo, and he wondered idly whether Debbie dyed her hair. He wouldn't hold it against her, not after the mind-blowing thank-you sex they'd had when she'd come home to find the dog. Then Marvel's heart pitched like a roller coaster ride. It got stuck in his throat and swelled there like a sponge. "Get her back," he choked. "Are you okay, sir?" He shook his head. It felt like a heart attack, but that wasn't important. He hobbled to the benches and sat down heavily next to the woman with the tattooed arms, still staring at the photo. "Get her back! Get her back!" Aguda dropped a ball of wet paper towels and yanked open the door. Through the glass, he could see her running, hear her calling. Marvel looked again at the photograph. Not at Sandra, not at Mitzi, but beyond them, to the line of blurred people caught in mid-clap. So far, so faint, so fuzzy, so familiar. One of them was Edie Evans. Chapter 20. For a long while after she was abducted, Edie Evans hoped it was by aliens. She woke from a deep sleep, still wearing her space helmet, and stared up at a dark ceiling with gleaming pipes and flared ports running along it. She recognized it immediately. It was the ventilation system of a spaceship. A little flower of mist blossomed and died on her visor every time she breathed out and breathed in. The close sound of her lungs filling and emptying only added to her certainty. She was in space. Edie was excited by it. The mist on her visor bloomed a little bigger at the thought. She started to turn her head to look at the walls, but it hurt to do that, and she winced and stayed still for a couple of minutes, blinking at the pipes. But now her head was hurting. She tried to ignore it, and to think about how she might have got here. She had been riding her bike to school, and then she'd woken up. And between those two moments, things were fuzzy. Edie frowned and tried to remember if there had been a bright white beam or any sense of floating. But because she couldn't remember either, they both remained possible in her mind, like that cat in the box. Dad had told her the story about some guy who had a cat in a box that was both dead and alive until you opened the lid and found out which it was. So until she remembered something different, she definitely could have been abducted by aliens. Edie could remember earlier things, though. She could remember saying goodbye to her mother as she pedaled away in the half-light of the early January morning. A brief glimpse over her shoulder and the feeling of the bike wobbling slightly as she raised a quick hand in farewell. She could remember doing a good swerve to miss a dog poo on the pavement. She could remember stopping to zip up her anorak because it was even colder than it looked. She could remember cutting across the corner of the wide green patch they all called the woods. There wasn't a proper path there, but local people had made one just by taking the shortest route through the grass. In the winter the path was mud. In the summer it was flat and hard. Today it had been cold and dry, the grass alongside it encrusted with dark diamonds of frost. She could remember swinging out of the woods and onto the pavement next to the road. After that, she couldn't remember anything until now. Edie tried turning her head again, and this time when it hurt she thought about being at home in bed, with Mum stroking her forehead and Dad calling the doctor. Maybe she'd ask the aliens to take her home. She was pretty sure they would at some point. There wasn't much Edie Evans didn't know about aliens, and she knew that nobody got abducted forever. She was sure they'd take her home right away if she asked. For some reason, thinking about going home made her throat ache, and she nearly cried, and her visor misted right up. It wasn't really a space helmet. It was a skateboard helmet that Dad had fixed with a tinted visor so she could be an astronaut as she rode her rocket bicycle to school every day. "One small BMX for mankind," he always said. Without turning her head again, Edie carefully reached out her hand and felt around the floor for her bike. It wasn't there. They must have left it on Earth. She got a pang and hoped Frankie wasn't riding it already. Much of Edie's life was devoted to keeping her bicycle out of her little brother's clutches. He never took care of anything. He had left his own bike outside so often that his trainer wheels had rusted right through. The thought of him mistreating her bike the whole time she was in space was infuriating, and at the same time made her miss him. Her visor misted up again, obscuring the gleaming pipes overhead. After a while, Edie fell asleep, with her arms still outstretched, her delicate fingers curled and weightless. When she woke for the second time, she was in a bed, but it wasn't her own. Even though it was so dark that she couldn't see a thing, Edie felt sure that was true because this bed smelled like a road. She sat up carefully. Her head had stopped aching, and she was sorry she'd cried. Cross with herself for being a baby, being in space was the most exciting thing that had ever happened to her, or to anyone she knew, and she should make the most of it. Then when she got home, she could tell people all about it, especially Dad. He'd be gutted he'd missed it. Slowly, she stuck her left hand straight out into the darkness and moved it about. There was nothing in front of her, but to her left, she felt a smooth, cold wall. She kept her hand there, feeling safer for touching something solid. "Hello?" she shouted. Her voice sounded short and dull and like it wasn't going anywhere. She didn't like it, so she didn't shout again. From somewhere a long way off, there was the rhythmic hiss and underwater thudding of a great engine. The spaceship was on the move. Where were they going? Were they leaving their orbit of Earth and heading for the stars? She got a little thrill of terror. With her left hand flat against the cold wall, Edie felt the bed with her right. It wasn't a proper bed. It was like a camping one. The canvas sides were stitched over a tubular steel frame. She crawled slowly to the end and bumped her head on a wall. She felt around and found her space helmet and put it on. Then she turned and crawled even more slowly to the other end until the helmet hit another wall. Wherever she was, it was only as long as the bed. Edie leaned as far as she could to the right without leaving the anchor of her left hand on the wall, but couldn't feel the floor or another wall. Maybe she was in a pod, hundreds of feet up a wall, in a hive of other captives. She imagined the beings around her, of every intergalactic species, each one thinking it was alone in the dark. It was exciting when you thought about it. "Hello?" she said carefully. "I'm Edie." Nobody else said anything. Maybe they didn't understand English. Maybe to them English was just like an oink or a purr would be to her. She wouldn't talk back to a pig or a cat. There was a blanket folded at one end of the bed. It wasn't a nice soft one like the one they put over Nanny's knees when they took her out in the wheelchair. It was cold and itchy. In the black nothingness, and with one hand flat against the wall, Edie fingered the thin, rough wool. In all this weirdness, the blanket was the only thing that made Edie really uneasy. Since she'd been a little girl, Edie had read hundreds of books and watched dozens of films and TV shows about space. She knew that the first spacemen were fruit flies and monkeys, and a dog called Laika. She knew that Neil Armstrong was the first man to walk on the moon, and that Buzz Aldrin was the second, and that Michael Collins had stayed in the getaway car That's what Dad always said. They got dropped off on the moon and he stayed in the car for a quick getaway. She knew about Sally Ride and Helen Sharman, and satellites and Hubble, and the rings of Saturn. She knew that the sun was really a star, and that all the other stars were so far away that it would take her years and years to get there, even if she went in a beam of light, like a speck. Alongside all the real stuff, Edie knew all about Vulcans and Jedis and close encounters. She knew about their lightsabers and mind melds, and the metal chips they put in your head, so they always knew how to find you again. And even though that stuff wasn't real, maybe one day it would be, or already was on another planet. So there wasn't much Edie Evans didn't know about aliens, and she was pretty sure that they didn't have itchy blankets. Edie started to worry then, started to be afraid that she had been taken by a human being, and for another reason entirely. She knew about those things, too. But before that fear could properly dig its claws into Edie's fertile imagination, a light went on, and an alien walked into the room. Chapter 21. Marvel got Anna Buck a cup of tea from the machine. This time he made sure it was tea because that's what she had asked for. "Thank you," she said softly when he put it on the desk in front of her. "Do you want something to eat?" he asked. She shook her head. Marvel had brought Aguda into the room with them, partly because she was a woman, which might be useful, and partly because he was grudgingly impressed by the way she had handled things so far. Handled herself and handled other people. Even hanging up on him made sense now, with the benefit of hindsight. Aguda spoke carefully to Anna. "Do you want me to call someone to come and fetch the baby?" Anna hesitated, then shook her head and looked at the tabletop. "I don't trust James," she said. "Not with children." Aguda shot a quizzical glance at Marvel, who sat down opposite Anna, wincing at the pain in his knee and his groin. Like everything else on this case, he wasn't sure where to start. He wasn't even sure which case he was working on. Did Anna Buck know that Edie Evans was in the photo of Sandra and Mitzi? Was she a dumb stooge in the opening gambit of a cruel negotiation, or an unlikely mastermind? Each option had a million implications and permutations, all built on the bizarre quicksand of a 5x7 snapshot, carried into this world by a madwoman and her phony baby. Whatever the answer, Marvel needed to know what the hell was going on. And if that meant being all touchy-feely with a nutcase while he found out what she had to tell him, then he was prepared to do it. For Edie Evans. The photograph lay on the table between them, starting to curl at the edges now that it was drying out. "This photo," Marvel started, then looked at the picture and stopped. Every time he saw it, it hit him again. Edie was the third person along, behind the blue rope. Her face was turned away from the camera, and even if it hadn't been, it would have been too blurred to be identified as anything more than a girl by almost anybody else. But Marvel knew it was her. He had spent a year learning Edie Evans, a year learning her shape, the way she stood, how her hair hung, pushed behind that one sticky-out ear. He knew her like a parent, with his gut. And when he'd studied the photo more closely, the strange, abstract, angular thing glimpsed between the hazy legs of the people had suddenly become Edie's bicycle, lying in the grass behind her. It had almost brought tears to his eyes to see it there. He thought he had exhausted the evidence in the Edie Evans case. He'd been over it so often he knew it by heart. It had become meaningless with repetition. But this was new. Out of nowhere. A tiny spark that might illuminate everything. And it had come in a photo of Sandra Clyde and her lost poodle Mitzi. John Marvel didn't believe in coincidence any more than he believed in global warming, and the convergence of the two cases made him deeply suspicious. But it also made him feel like the very start of being drunk, foolish and disorientated. "Tell me about this photo."
"It's of this woman, Sandra, and her dog."
"Do you recognize anyone else in the picture?" She frowned.
"There isn't anyone else in the picture."
"Do you know where it was taken?"
"No."
"Or when?"
"No."
"And where did you get it?"
"From Sandra, a few weeks ago, at the church."
"Did you speak to anybody about it?"
"No."
"Nobody from the church?"
"About the photo, no."
Aguda interrupted.
"May I see it, sir?"
Marvel nodded, and she slid the photo across the table and bent closely over it. He turned his attention back to Anna Buck. "You called Sandra earlier today. Why?"
She shrugged. "I told you already. On the phone. It sounds stupid now."
"Tell me again." There was a long, reluctant silence before Anna said haltingly,
"I saw things because of the photo. I think I did anyway. I wanted to see if they meant anything to her, in case it would help her to find her dog, because my son—"
She stopped and swallowed, then went on.
"My son, Daniel, he's missing too."
"Daniel Buck?" She nodded. Marvel knew of the case. He and DCI Lloyd, over in Serious Crime, had compared notes briefly a few months before. But the two cases hadn't had anything in common apart from vague geography. One boy, one girl, one toddler, one 12-year-old. One who'd run out of a door left open, the other the victim of what looked like a planned abduction and possible foul play. A few miles wasn't all that separated the cases. Anna nodded and went on.
"I suppose I hoped that helping her, if I helped her, maybe somehow someone would help me find Daniel too, d'you see?"
She looked at him with such hope and sincerity that Marvel found himself nodding in ridiculous agreement. "What goes around comes around," he said.
"Exactly."
She smiled, and when she did, Anna Buck's face lit up, as if from within.
"Exactly that. What goes around, like karma, you know. I wasn't trying to interfere or obstruct anyone. I was only trying to help find the dog, in case someone could help me."
She tailed off into silence and wiped her nose on the back of her hand. Marvel sighed. "The dog's back home," he said without pleasure. "It was returned this morning." Marvel had been driving to work when Sandra Clyde called to say Mitzi was home.
"I just opened the door, and there she was. And she jumped into my arms and gave me a million kisses and then went running round the house and the garden and her bowl and her little green monkey. So happy, weren't you, baby girl? Who's Mummy's Mitzi, Mitzi, moo moo? Who's Mummy's—"
"Who found her?" Marvel interrupted.
"A boy," said Sandra. "A dear, sweet little boy. He had her on a lead, made from his school tie. It was like something out of Just William. I just opened the door and he said, 'Is this your dog?' And I said, 'Yes, it is. I've been looking everywhere for her.' And I kissed him and I kissed Mitzi. I think he was quite embarrassed, poor child."
"How did he know where you lived?"
"He said he just knocked on doors, and someone recognized Mitzi from one of the photos I'd given out. I put them through hundreds of doors, you know."
Marvel knew that. He also knew it meant the dog wasn't home because of anything he'd done. That was bad news. How could Superintendent Clyde be very grateful to him now that some random brat had returned the bloody dog because of the efforts of his wife? If that was what had happened. Marvel's natural suspicion stirred in his belly. How could he find out? He needed to regain his lost leverage. His mind darted about, feeling for a chink. "Don't pay the reward yet, Mrs. Clyde." There was a stuttering break in her stream of doggy consciousness, and Marvel knew before she even said so that the reward money had already been paid. £1,000. The idiot.
"He didn't want to take it, of course," Sandra Clyde was babbling. "He was such a sweet boy. I had to make him, and then you should have seen his little face."
"Check or cash?" he interrupted bluntly.
"Check."
"So you have his name?"
"Well, no. I mean, he's just a little boy, you see. So he doesn't have a bank account, and so I made it out to cash."
Marvel swore under his breath and did a U-turn under a no U-turn sign to a chorus of disapproving horns. "I'll be there in 10 minutes, he told her roughly. "In the meantime, call your bank and put a stop on the check."
"Put a stop on it?"
"Yes, stop the check. Right now." He hung up on her before she could irritate him further. The check would be stopped. The reward money would not be paid. Even a guilty person would come back to find out what had happened. And Marvel would be there when he did. Anna Buck had paled. Now she looked Marvel steadily in the eye for the first time since they'd sat down.
"What time this morning?"
"Around 7:30.
"Oh,"
Anna said softly and looked away again.
"That's before—"
She trailed off, but her face was an open book. If there had been guilt and deception, Marvel believed he would have read it. There was neither. If anything, Anna looked embarrassed. With good reason, thought Marvel. Mitzi was safely back home before she'd had her so-called visions, before she'd phoned Sandra Clyde, and long before she'd had a funny turn at the police station. It all made her look pretty stupid.
"I'm happy for Sandra,"
she said dully, then looked at him earnestly.
"I really am."
John Marvel nodded. He could see the bad in anyone, but he was having trouble with Anna Buck, and that uncertainty confused him. Mentally and physically, she looked smaller now, weaker and less connected. It might have been because her plan to extort money from Sandra Clyde had been thwarted, or because her karmic leverage on the universe had disappeared the minute Mitzi had been found. Just like his own. His instinct was to pin her to the wall like a butterfly, pour scorn on her visions, and force her to confess that she was just a scammer looking for an easy mark, foiled by a schoolboy sleuth. But something stopped him, and for a moment he was at a loss. Then Aguda cleared her throat and made eye contact.
"Sir?"
She lowered her voice, and he leaned in to look at what she was pointing out in the photo. The gold lettering printed on the ribbons of the rosette. Marvel squinted and leaned back. He kept a magnifying glass in his desk drawer for small print, but he didn't have it here. "What does it say?" he asked testily.
"Beckenham Show 1999.
Beckenham? Marvel frowned. Beckenham wasn't far from Edith's home. That made sense. When was last year's show held?
"I don't know, sir."
Marvel nodded and was about to let it go. It was minor. It was meaningless. It didn't matter. But it would get Aguda out of the room, which suddenly seemed like a good idea. "Go and find out, will you?"
"Yes, sir,"
she said, and left. The door clicked shut, and there was a deep silence, as if they'd both been waiting for her to go.
"I remember you,"
said Anna softly. Marvel nodded a brief acknowledgement. He didn't expect a thank you, and he didn't get one. Without the inhibition of a witness, he tapped the picture. "Mrs. Buck, can you tell me what it was that you saw when you looked at this photo?"
"What does it matter now? The dog is home."
"That's true," he acknowledged. "But indulge me. Tell me what you told Sandra. And anything else you can remember." She looked at him warily. "Please," he said with sincerity that sounded genuine, even to his own ears. "I want to know what you saw." He held the photo out to her again. This time she took it, but immediately put it face down on the table between them. For a long moment he thought Anna Buck was going to refuse to say anything else. But then she sat a little more upright in her chair and said softly, "I saw a garden." Marvel went cold. His fingers pressed so hard on the Edie Evans file that the tips went white. Under his splayed hands were the interviews with the psychic Richard Latham. Marvel didn't believe a single word the man said, but he knew every one of them off by heart. Latham's visions were random and unverifiable. A broken glass jug, a white disc with a red center, rolling across a floor. A fake garden. Marvel's voice was tight. "What kind of garden?" "Just a garden," said Anna, "but it wasn't right." "What do you mean, not right?" "I don't know," she shrugged. "There was just something a bit wrong with it. Like it wasn't real." Chapter 22. Edie Evans drew a garden on the wall of the tiny concrete room. She had said she was bored, and 2 days later the alien had brought her hundreds and hundreds of wax crayons, all broken stubs in 2 plastic carrier bags. She was lucky they had crayons aboard the spaceship, but all the good colors were gone. There was no bright red or orange, and those were her 2 favorites. But she started drawing flowers on the wall beside the little camp bed whenever the light was on, which usually it was. Sometimes the alien switched it off as he left, and on those days, or nights, Edie had to be very, very patient, because the gaps between stars were huge, and you couldn't expect to see the next one soon. Maybe not even in your lifetime. But whenever the light was on, she drew flowers. Mostly blue and purple and a few yellow ones, but there weren't that many yellow crayons either, so she had to make do. She made all the middles yellow, so that the blue and purple flowers weren't so dark. There were a few maroon crayons, and she used them sparingly too, and a blue that was too dark for anything, even the sky. There were lots of whites and blacks and browns, so she made a white window frame so that it was like looking out of her bedroom, across her garden, to the woods beyond. She coloured the trees, enjoying the bobbly rough sensation of the wax passing from each crayon to the cement trunks. It wasn't like using a pen. The crayons shrank in her determined fist as they escaped to the wall, layer by layer. She could watch it happening, and wondered at the change from coloured stick to coloured wall. Often she would have to stop and peel back paper from the wax crayons so she could keep colouring. After Edie finished the window and the garden, it wasn't enough, so she recreated the rest of her bedroom around the walls, all from memory. Her wallpaper, her posters, the door with Neil Armstrong on it, the old fireplace, the shelf with the clock, and Pink Ted and Pengy the Penguin, and her books. She wrote the title on each spine, trying to remember all of them. Island of Adventure, Chocky, The Silver Sword, Matilda. There were more. And so she drew blank books so she could write on the spines as she remembered. She drew Peter in his cage, and hoped Frankie was feeding him and playing with him. She drew his cage much bigger than it really was, just in case, and put in extra toys. Then she made sure there was plenty of water, and lots of brown and black food in the little purple bowl. It was hard to fit everything onto the walls because the room was so small, only as long as the camp bed and 3 times its width. But Edie did her best. Her fingers quickly smelled of wax and were tipped with little crescent rainbows under each nail. The alien came every day. He was tall and skinny, and his face was a mask above a flowing black shroud that hung to his hips. The slanted black eyes did not blink, and in the wan glow of the small fluorescent strip the teeth glimmered sharply within the rictus of the lips. At first, she was scared of the mask. She'd been scared a lot at the beginning, despite her mind's best efforts to construct a story she could live by, remain sane by. But after a while she became more scared of what might be behind the mask, and hoped she never found out. On that first day, the alien had brought a dead chicken with him, and Edie had crouched in mute terror as he'd sung a strange song and swung the chicken over her head in circles. There hadn't been any blood, but white feathers had fallen from the bird onto the bed, and after the alien had left, Edie had gathered them together and cried for the poor chicken. There were 17 feathers, ranging from the little tufty, fluffy ones, right up to the single long quill, like something you could write with. It had slender spines that separated with an actual tiny sound, and then knitted back together so perfectly you couldn't see the join. Every day after that he brought her water in a tall glass jug, and proper food, bread and butter, old bananas, and dented pots of custard or rice pudding. A mug for drinking and a plastic spoon, a bowl and a bar of yellow soap that smelled like lemons but tasted like soap. "What do you want?" she asked him once early on, and when he didn't answer she got cross and shouted, "What do you want?" "Shh," he said. "Shh, shh." And then he left. Every time he went, Edie shuddered with relief, and then fretted in case he didn't come back. But he always did, with more water and a bruised apple or a box of Ritz crackers. They were soft, but she didn't care. She was in a space station where you couldn't go out, and supplies had to come from Earth once a year. Right now they were having to eat up all the stuff from the back of the cupboards. But soon the supply ship would dock, and then they'd have Brazil nuts and shampoo and Marmite sandwiches. Edie wondered whether the other astronauts, prisoners, were humans too. Maybe if they were beings from all over the galaxy, like on Star Trek, then the cupboards were full of all kinds of foods from all kinds of planets. She wondered if there was an alien whose job it was to feed the right thing to the right species, just like she gave Peter mouse food, not dog food, or if they all had to eat Ritz crackers. When she wasn't drawing on the wall, she liked to wear her space helmet and imagine that she was piloting the ship, and that the other astronauts were right next door, and she only had to call out or knock on the wall, and they would call or knock back. She didn't do it, of course, in case they were busy with scientific experiments or in hypersleep. And because that first shouted hello had scared her so badly that she didn't want to put another to the test. Getting nothing back would be confirmation that she was really alone. Once the alien reached out slowly and touched her hair. Edie pressed herself into the corner at the far end of the bed. She started to cry. She couldn't help it. "Please don't," she whispered. "Please don't touch me." The alien withdrew. For now. Chapter 23. "Take a tray," said D.S. Brady, handing him one. "What for?" "Cover." Marvel dropped the tray back onto the pile with a clatter. Brady held on to his and put an iced bun on it defiantly. They were a dozen people behind Richard Latham in the queue at the Marks and Spencer Cafe. They'd gone to his little terraced house and knocked on his front door until his neighbor had come out and told them where he'd probably gone. "He goes there all the time," she'd added. "Yeah?" Brady had said. "Why?" "The company, I think." Now Marvel looked around at the coldly corporate cafe and wondered how that could be true. The low ceiling, pale floor, and dark chairs made the place feel cold and unwelcoming. There was a long line of mostly elderly people shuffling slowly towards the till, sliding their trays along a system of rails so they didn't have to carry them and walk at the same time. Inappropriate pop music encouraged them to pick up the pace a bit, but they weren't having any of it. The King's Arms it wasn't. "Anything to eat, my love?" A middle-aged woman smiled cheerfully at Marvel. She wore the round-collared tunic of a performing monkey, complete with a matching hat that was not unlike a fez. Before Marvel could even hesitate, she took the glass covers off 2 huge cakes and held them up like cymbals.
"Lovely bit of carrot cake," she said, "ever so moist."
"Okay, then," he heard himself saying without thinking, and she laughed, as if it made her the happiest woman in Bromley, and chose the biggest slice there was for him. "Put it on your tray," Marvel ordered Brady. Latham was already at the till. His tray had a tea cake on it. Marvel watched the befezzed woman behind the till beam at him. Over the music he heard her say, "Morning, Richard." Marvel couldn't hear the response, but there was a friendly exchange. The woman giggled and chatted while Latham handed over his money and got his loyalty card stamped. Marvel watched him shuffle along a bit and pick up a cup and a pot of tea, then stand there for a moment looking around, apparently for his company. Was it friends, a woman, the accomplice who knocked on the church ceiling? Latham walked across the cafe, and Marvel saw for the first time that there was something wrong with his feet or legs. He had a strange, lilting walk, a slow bounce to his gait. He kept his elbows high to avoid spillage, and people turned their heads absently to watch him pass, even as they talked and ate, alert to the abnormal. He put his tray down on a table for 2, alone. The queue edged forward.
"Lucas, hold on to the handle, or you won't get any cake."
Marvel turned to see a woman behind him with a pushchair. A boy of about 3 was beside her, Lucas. The boy sidled back over and fixed his chubby fist around the metal bar of the pushchair, and when his mother set off to catch up with the queue, his arm jerked, and he had to jog a few paces to keep from falling. Marvel stared at the child. When he was that age, his mother had kept him on reins, like a pet pony. Years after they had grown out of them, Marvel and his brother had taken turns using them around the house, riding each other from room to room, flapping the reins to go faster, and pulling them back and going, "Whoa!" to stop, then pawing the air with their hands to show they were rearing up. Reins were much safer, much more fun, than having to hold on to the handle.
"Can I help you?"
Lucas's mother was looking at him in a challenging way. "No," said Marvel. "I was just wondering, whatever happened to reins for children?" The woman narrowed her eyes at him and tutted, then put a hand around Lucas's wrist in a belt-and-braces gesture that almost made Marvel laugh. Parents saw danger in all the wrong places. Children were stupid and easily distracted, and predators were alert to the slightest opportunity. There wasn't much anyone could do about that fatal combination. It was the luck of the draw. He picked up the file marked Evans, Edith, 23778/SE-G, off Colin Brady's tray, and under the suspicious eye of Lucas's mother, peeled out of the queue and walked over to the table where Richard Latham was shaking a sachet of sugar. "Mr. Latham, DCI John Marvel." Latham squinted up with big brown eyes, and Marvel sat down. He never bothered to ask if he could, because nobody ever said yes. "Can I help you?" said Latham. "Yes," said Marvel, and laid down the photo Anna Buck had brought in. "What can you tell me about this?" Latham blinked so hard it was close to flinching. "I don't—" he started. What do you mean, what can I tell you?" He was rattled. Marvel liked that. Colin Brady put his tray on the photo. There were 2 slices of carrot cake on it, a cup of coffee, and a glass of water. Brady was on a diet and decided that drinking water before eating anything, however calorific, was the way to do it.
"I got you an Americano, sir."
"Take the tray off the bloody photo, will you?" Brady raised the tray so that Marvel could slip the photo out from underneath. But annoyingly, it had given Latham a chance to regain his composure. Now he was looking away from Marvel and up at Brady instead. "Hello, Sergeant?"
"Mr. Latham."
"This photo," insisted Marvel. "Nothing mystical, just what can you tell me?" Nothing mystical, eh? Latham tipped the sugar into his tea. His movements were deliberate, and Marvel knew he was playing for time. He took a bite of tea cake, then leaned forward and peered at the photo. Well, now, let's see. He stared at the photo for so long that Marvel could almost hear his brain formulating an adequate answer. Finally, Latham said, Yes, I believe this lady comes to our church. You know her name? Sandra. And? I can't tell you much, I'm afraid. She lost her dog and thought I might be able to help her find it. And did you? I still hope I can. I believe the dog is alive, so that's a good thing, isn't it? Depends, said Marvel, on how much you like dogs. I suppose so, said Latham. I'm a cat person myself. How about you? Marvel said, Did Sandra give you a photo too? As I recall, she gave out a lot of photos of the dog. I probably had one. This one? I really can't remember. Latham looked around the room as if for an exit and pushed his glasses up his nose, sweating. Do you recognize anyone else in this photo? Latham studied it again. No, he said. Okay, said Marvel. He slid the photo away from Richard Latham and saw the relief in his eyes as it went. He loved it when a suspect thought the hard part was over. Mr. Latham, how do you know Anna Buck? Who's Anna Buck? Young woman, said Marvel. Came to your church a few weeks back for the first time. Latham looked blank. Had a baby in a buggy, never cried. Oh, yes, said Latham. I remember. So that's how you know her, then? Well, I didn't know her name. Did you talk to her? No. She says you spoke. I don't think so. She says... Bit of cake, Richard. They all looked up at a woman in a fez. She was clearing tables and held a damp rag in one hand and a teapot in the other. No thanks, Denise. The tea cake will be fine for now. You sure now, darling? Don't want you wasting away? Denise laughed and looked at Marvel and Brady and said, Richard used to be much larger, you know, but now he's only a medium. She cackled and patted Latham's shoulder with the damp rag before bustling away, leaving an awkward silence in her wake. She says she spoke to you about her son. Marvel started again. Oh, yes, said Latham. She did. Then why tell me she didn't? You weren't specific. She didn't speak to me the first time, but a week later she came back. She wanted a private consultation. In return for a donation to the church roof fund, I presume. Latham's composure wavered again, only a flicker, but it was there, and Marvel noted it. No, said Latham. I couldn't help her. Why not? Isn't it your job to help her? Latham sighed and shook his head. That's not how it works, Mr. Marvel. Spirits choose what to show and whom they show it to. I can only be open to them, a conduit for communication. But I'm not the one in control. If you're not in control, who is? The dead, said Latham. He gave a grim smile. The dead are in control. Great, said Marvel. Maybe I'll take this up with them. Maybe you should. Marvel resisted the temptation to continue the childish exchange. Latham had started out shakily when he'd seen the photo, but was getting more comfortable now, and Marvel needed him off balance again, where he might trip over his own ego, if not his own lies. You know what else Anna Buck saw in this photo, Mr. Latham? No. Edie Evans. Latham frowned. Where? Marvel put a finger above the blurred image, and Latham bent down until he was just inches from the picture. How can you tell? I can tell, said Marvel. Trust me. Really? Said Latham. I wouldn't have recognized her. What did you tell Mrs. Buck about Edie? Nothing. You didn't discuss the case at all? No. Why would I? Interesting, said Marvel, because when Anna Buck looked at this photo, she had a vision. Did she? Said Latham. Well, good for her. Of a garden. Blink. Just like you did. Blink. And do you know what she said about the garden? Marvel waited for Latham to respond, but when he didn't, he flipped open his notebook and read from the interview with Anna Buck. She said there was just something a bit wrong with it. Like it wasn't real. He closed the notebook. Sounds familiar, doesn't it? Richard Latham looked down at the spoon, stirring his tea. Click, click, click. A garden is a common spiritual motif, Mr. Marvel. You remember what you said when you were shown Edie's picture a year ago? Not really. I do, said Marvel. He didn't bother opening the file. You said, she's looking at a garden through a window, but there's something strange about it, as if it's not real. He looked steadily at Latham, who raised his eyebrows and shrugged and said, Well, that's some coincidence, said Marvel. If you believe in coincidence, said Latham. I don't, said Marvel. Nor me. Well then, Mr. Latham, it can't be a coincidence that Anna Buck comes to your church. It can't be a coincidence that she has a private consultation with you about her missing son, when you were involved in the hunt for another missing child. And it can't be a coincidence that a few weeks later she has the same so-called vision as you claim to have had a year earlier. I grant you that is strange, said Latham. I don't think it's strange at all, said Marvel. I think it's a logical progression with one important step left out. You told her about the Edie Evans case. Why would I do that? Simple. You tell her, she tells us, we tell the family. And somewhere along the line, somebody pays you for more of your useless information. Except I didn't tell her. Marvel gave a grim smile. This is all in a day's work to you, Latham. You squeeze suckers over lost dogs and dead relatives every week at your so-called church. But missing kids pay better than dogs, don't they? You know that, if anybody does. I don't know what you're talking about, Mr. Marvel. I'm not in this for the money. Yeah, but it never hurts, does it? Sneered Marvel. Puts a few slates on the church roof, right? Latham shrugged. It's a big roof, and a small church. All donations are gratefully received. Marvel lowered his voice menacingly. You took $2,000 off us in donations and gave us nothing. Latham looked at him with amphibian eyes. I did all anyone could for Edie Evans. Maybe, said Marvel. Maybe not. Or maybe Anna Buck is just better at this than you are. I mean, if you didn't tell her about Edie Evans, if she really did see something in this photo that even you can't, maybe she's the real shut-eye, Latham. Maybe you just weren't up to the job. Latham's lips tightened, and Marvel knew he'd scored a direct hit on the man's fat ego. You forget something, Mr. Marvel, said Latham. It wasn't my job to find Edie Evans. It was yours, your job, and you couldn't do it. Marvel's fist twitched. Excuse me? Latham shrugged and went on. I'm not blaming you. I'm sure you did your best, but I suppose you can't win 'em all. You can't win 'em all, said Marvel angrily. That's your answer. Latham shrugged, picked up his napkin and carefully wiped his buttery fingers. Either way, he sighed, it makes no difference in the end. Marvel wanted to smash his face in. It made a big difference to Edie Evans, he shouted. People were looking at them now. Marvel didn't care. Your stupid fantasies about white wheels and broken glass, wasting our time, wasting her time. You're wrong about wasting time, said Latham, who had somehow regained an infuriating air of calm. To people like you, life's a long line that starts here and ends there. But existence is a continuum of life and death, a grand circle, and a circle never ends. Life and death are one and the same, and time is irrelevant. Marvel snorted, and Latham smiled. You snorted Einstein, Mr. Marvel. Did you know that his theory of general relativity postulates that the past and the future may exist simultaneously? So is it so unscientific to think that some of us can see that nexus right here and now? And I do see it. Not all of it. And believe me, I don't always want to see it. But... He leaned across the table and stared intently at Marvel through his thick lenses. Your future, he whispered, is my memory. Marvel felt an illogical chill. For one gut-wrenching moment he was on a precipice, with his own destiny gaping blackly before him, and the past at his back, pressing him gently but firmly towards the edge. Somewhere in his soul he could hear the overhang crumbling under his frightened feet, pieces of stone clicking away like unlucky dice. "Can you remember next week's lottery numbers?" said Brady. They both ignored him, but it broke the spell, and Marvel leaned across the table so that his nose almost touched Latham's. "Mumbo fucking jumbo. You can't see Edie Evans, and you never could. You see nothing but money. I see your future, Latham, and it's in handcuffs." Latham dabbed carefully at his mouth with the napkin. "Is that some kind of threat, Mr. Marvel?" "You bet your ass it is," said Marvel, "and D.S. Brady is my witness." Latham screwed up the napkin and dropped it into his teacup, where it browned and swelled. "The next time you're feeling guilty about Edie Evans, Mr. Marvel, don't come crying to me." "Fuck off," said Marvel. He stood up furiously. Brady looked up at him in surprise, then he stood too, with a forkful of carrot cake in his hand. Marvel jabbed an angry finger across the table, making Latham flinch. "I'll find out what happened to Edie, without your so-called help." He turned, then remembered. "And you can stop tapping Sandra Clyde for cash, too, because her dog was returned to her this morning. No thanks to you." Latham gave Marvel a sanctimonious smile. "Isn't the important thing that she has her dog back? To her, maybe, not to me. I'm sure she'll be unsurprised to hear it. And I'm sure you'll be giving her a refund on her donations to the church bloody roof." Latham raised his eyebrows mysteriously. "Who knows?" he said. "Maybe, in the future, I already have." "You piece of—" "Are these gentlemen bothering you, Richard?" Two middle-aged ladies were suddenly at the table. One was thin, the other was dumpy, but both had faux fezzes over their wispy grey hair, little round glasses, and the redoubtable self-confidence bestowed upon them by an M&S uniform and a reserve army of beige backups. "Yes," said Latham. "Actually, they are." "Time to go, I think, sir," said the dumpy one, holding out her arms to usher Marvel out. "I'm a police officer," he protested. "Well then, sir, you should know better." If she'd been a man, Marvel could have hit her. But what could he do with an old woman who barely reached his armpit? Nothing but obey. "Come on, Brady," he said. They'd only taken a couple of paces away from the table when Latham called out, "Sergeant Brady?" They stopped and turned around. Latham was looking at Colin Brady with an earnest expression on his face. "There'll be complications when your wife gives birth. You'll be worried the baby's going to die, but it won't. It will be just fine." Brady gave a hollow laugh. "I've had the snip, mate. Shows how much you know." "Oh," said Latham. He frowned, and then gave the smallest of smiles. "In that case, maybe you could give my message to your milkman." Brady swore and started towards him, but the dumpy woman said, Now, sticks and stones and all that," and somehow herded them both out of the cafe and into menswear. "Bastard," said Brady. "Fucking bastard," said Marvel. They strode past the fey white mannequins with their gilets and their man-bags, and out to the car park. Marvel fumed. "Did you see his face when he saw that photo?" Yeah, said Brady. White as a sheet. Then he tries to say he doesn't recognize her. Yeah, said Brady. Bloody fake, preying on the weak and vulnerable.
Funny about that garden thing, though.
Not if Latham told Mrs. Buck about it.
Yeah, said Brady. But if he didn't...
Marvel gave a dismissive snort and stormed through the car park, while Brady hurried to keep up. But the question did nag at him. What if Latham hadn't told Anna Buck about the garden? Where did that leave them? Nowhere he felt comfortable being. Maybe he hypnotized her or some crap, he thought out loud. He was on TV, you know what those pricks are like.
Yeah, said Brady thoughtfully. You think he meant that about the milkman?
Course not, said Marvel. He's just winding you up. The pink bumper sticker made Marvel's car easy to spot. Bloody thing, he said, and slapped the Edie Evans file against Brady's chest. He squatted behind the BMW and picked at one corner of the sticker. He's a fake, no question, he went on, but he's hiding something else.
What?
Said Brady. I don't know, said Marvel, but I'm gonna find out. He yanked off the sticker with a single elastoplastic rip. The paint came off with it. When Marvel got back to the station, Emily Aguda deepened his bad mood by telling him that last year's Beckenham Dog Show had been held on the 14th of September. Impossible, said Marvel. Edie was abducted on January 12th.
I checked with Mrs. Clyde.
Marvel waved that away dismissively. Mrs. Clyde doesn't know whether she's Arthur or bloody Martha.
Aguda pursed her lips diplomatically and read from her notebook. So then I spoke to the show secretary. There was a show in April last year and another in September, but the April one was indoors.
I don't care if it was indoors or outdoors, said Marvel. She couldn't have been at either. It must have been held earlier than that.
Aguda looked puzzled.
Check again, he told her. Get it right. Chapter 24. When Anna got home, James was in the nursery with Daniel's red dungarees in his hand.
What are you doing? She said.
Nothing, he said.
Putting these away. Where have you been?
Anna took the dungarees from him and went to the chest of drawers.
They were already away.
No, they weren't.
They were on the bed.
He was lying. She never left them out. Before she laid them in the bottom drawer with the rest of his clothes, Anna pressed them to her face, to her nose. They still smelled faintly of Daniel. That was why she never washed them. The only thing in the flat she hadn't washed and scrubbed and washed again. She'd have to wash the baby's clothes now, after what that woman did to him, and the blanket that had fallen on the floor, and his bedding, and their bedding and everything.
Where have you been?
The police station.
What for? I thought I could help someone who'd lost their dog.
A lost dog?
How?
Anna hesitated, but she was not a liar. She'd never seen the point when the truth was so much simpler to remember.
I had a vision, she said. I looked at a photograph of the dog, and I had a vision. Since when do you have visions?
She said nothing. She opened another drawer and smoothed the clothes in it, just for something to do. They'd all have to be washed, but not today. She would have to do everything in the correct order, efficiently, so that one thing did not contaminate the next.
Is this about that bloody church?
When she didn't answer him, James said,
A vision of what? Of a garden, and of circles, and 88.
She shrugged.
88 what?
I don't know. James sighed.
You know all this makes you sound mental, right?
I know.
I just thought there might be something to do with the dog.
Of course.
Why wouldn't they?
Sarcasm didn't become him. James never used to be sarcastic with her. Before.
"Nobody believes shit like that," he went on. "The police took it seriously," she said without inflection. "Were they wearing white coats?" She knew he was trying to be mean, but she ignored it. "They asked me all about it, and to draw pictures of all the things I saw. They had me there for 2 hours.
"Yeah?" said James. That obviously surprised him, and he lost that knowing expression.
"It was nothing to do with the dog, though. The dog had already been found."
James laughed, relieved to be back on solid ground.
"They thought it might have something to do with a girl who went missing."
"What girl?"
"Her name's Edie Evans. She was in the photo."
"What photo?"
"Of the dog.
"Where is it, then?"
The police kept it."
Anna opened another drawer, this one full of bits and bobs. The tie James had worn to his mother's funeral, spare batteries, a small sheaf of Daniel's drawings that had been transferred from the play school to the fridge, and then were too precious to make their logical way to the bin. Wax crayon on butcher paper, random three-legged animals and wonky houses with curly smoke.
"Why are we even together?"
Anna said suddenly. James looked at her in surprise, but Anna felt calm inside, as if she were on a slow summer ocean. She couldn't believe that just a few hours earlier she had been curling up to die on a police station floor.
"I mean, we only got married because I was pregnant with Daniel."
"What?" He looked at her in disbelief.
"You know that's not true."
Anna avoided his eyes.
"And now he's gone."
She stopped. She had said that without crying. She said it again.
"Now he's gone."
The second time was a charm, and she felt the lump growing in her throat that meant that soon she wouldn't be able to speak at all. She stared into the drawer filled with her son's baby clothes and whispered,
"You can go too, if you want."
James went. On his way out, he slammed the door and opened the floodgates. James only got as far as the King's Arms, where he drank until he ran out of money. Then he drank until he ran out of goodwill, and then he got into a scuffle with someone who wouldn't buy him another pint. Then he got thrown out. In revenge, he pissed into the drooping pansies planted in barrels along the front wall. They were already fighting a losing battle against the waterlogging, and the traffic, and the cigarette stubs, so it was a mercy killing, really. He headed for home. Anna had told him to leave, but he was going back. She might claim to have married him because of Daniel, but that wasn't the only reason he'd married her. So he was going home, or at least to the place where he paid the rent, and if she told him to leave again, he'd ignore her again. He'd drunk so much that he couldn't make it home, before he also needed to relieve himself again. So he stumbled down the alleyway next to the mini-mart, and pissed with his forearm against the wall and his face cradled in the crook. Hot and cold in shivery waves, dimly feeling the rain seeping under his collar and the splatter on his trainers. He thought of the red dungarees and the way they smelled of Daniel, and his eyes overflowed too.
"James?"
"What?"
"Okay."
"Piss off," he snuffled into his elbow. There was silence bar the sound of rain gurgling down the supermarket gutters.
"You want to eat?"
James turned his head to see Ang standing a few feet away, his thick black hair plastered close to his small head.
"What?" "You want to eat,"
repeated Ang, and gestured that James should follow him behind the building. James pushed off the wall gently, but still too hard, and stumbled backwards as he zipped up. Then he followed Ang round the back of the supermarket. He had disappeared.
"Hello,"
said Ang. He was in a skip holding a sandwich in a cardboard wrapper.
"What are you doing?"
said James.
"Eating."
James peered over the lip of the skip, and Ang switched on a torch. James noticed it was the one Brian Pigeon kept in the office. Ang directed the beam at the rubbish. Cardboard, plastic, a couple of black bags, and scattered food and broken packaging. Ang had collected a little pile of booty at his feet, bread rolls in plastic wrap, fish fingers and yogurt, 2 boxes of eggs, only half crushed. James wiped his face on his arm and said, "No, going home." Ang nodded doubtfully. "Okay," he said. "Me too." He put his food in a plastic bag and clambered out of the skip, and they walked together, James stumbling and Ang hovering around him like a worried bee, touching him now and then to keep him steady and headed in the right direction. Halfway home, James threw up. "Shit," said Ang. James swayed and wiped his mouth, and wondered how much the puddle of vomit had cost him. Whatever it was, they couldn't afford it. Maybe Anna would start working again, now she'd started going outside. Maybe going to the church hadn't been such a terrible thing, if it had reminded her that going out was what normal people did. Not going out to polish your dead child's footprints, but going out to the shops and the post office and a job, and coming home to a husband who wanted you back. Outside the garage, the footprints were filled with rain, and dancing with more. James stared down at them, and then squatted awkwardly. He put out an unsteady hand to touch the nearest of them, and only Ang's quick grip on his shoulder stopped him from falling on his face. He didn't try again. "So sorry, James," said Ang tenderly. "Me too," said James. The 5 footprints didn't remind him of Daniel. They reminded him only of doing something so wrong that he could never make it right. Anna would never forgive him. He couldn't blame her. When James got in, the lights were out, so he didn't turn them on. Anna was a restless sleeper. The kitchen floor was wet and the washing machine was on. Anna had obviously begun a major sweep of the house. He knew that the next few weeks would be chaotic, as she took the clean flat apart and put it back together even cleaner. It was mad, but it could be worse. Better a clean flat than a filthy one, and things would improve with time. James lived in the hope that they would, that they must. Although he was drunk, James knew he wouldn't be welcome in their bed tonight, even hanging off his own edge of the mattress. So, with a sigh, he opened the door to Daniel's bedroom and switched on the light. "Jesus," he breathed, and sobered like ice. It was all covered with paint, blue paint. James recognized the can on the chest of drawers as one of several that had been in the cupboard under the stairs for a few years. He'd used it to paint Daniel's toy chest, which had been pink when they'd got it from the charity shop. Anna had painted 4 huge circles on the walls, each the radius of her own arm, wonky and sloppy, with drips all over the floor and furniture. 3 circles filled one wall, and the 4th ran onto the next. She had moved the chest of drawers to accommodate the last one, and there were blue handprints all over that, too. It made him realize that she hadn't even used a brush. He looked at the circles and saw the unmistakable trails of fingers and palms. His wife had interrupted her obsessive cleaning operation to vandalize her own home. Unless someone else had done this. It suddenly seemed more likely, more horribly possible, that some crazed smackhead had broken into the flat while he was out getting pissed, assaulted his wife, vandalized the room, taken what little they had. Had he left the door open? James rushed into their bedroom and banged on the light with a frightened fist. Anna woke with a start. "What?" she said. "What's wrong?" She shielded her eyes with a single blue hand.